Hello, friends. Have you ever had a neighbor so nosy, so over-the-top intrusive, that it felt like you were starring in your own reality TV drama? Well, buckle up, because today, I'm sharing the jaw-dropping story of how my neighbor, Karen, demanded the keys to my house. Yes, you heard that right, my house. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary Sunday morning. I was basking in the satisfaction of completing a bold, abstract painting, a piece I'd poured my heart into for weeks. My small home-based gallery was my sanctuary, a space where I could lose myself in the strokes of my brush. But that day, something felt off, even as the sun streamed through my open curtains. Normally, I keep my curtains closed. Privacy is key when you're an artist deep in thought. But the bright morning light was too tempting to resist, so I left the drapes open. I had no idea that this small decision would lead to one of the strangest encounters of my life. Let me introduce Karen. She's the kind of neighbor who knows not just your name but your schedule, your favorite takeout order, and maybe even the brand of toothpaste you use. She lived diagonally behind my house on an elevated plot of land, which gave her an uncomfortably good view into my backyard, and apparently into my life. For months, I'd had this eerie sense of being watched. Sometimes, while I painted, I'd catch a flicker of movement from Karen's second-story window. I'd convince myself it was just a curtain swaying in the breeze or the glare of a TV. But then the comments started. "Your new painting is so blue, so calming," Karen said one afternoon, her sugary tone doing little to mask her curiosity. I froze. How could she possibly know that? I hadn't shared the piece with anyone, let alone displayed it somewhere she could see. At first, I laughed it off, chalking it up to a lucky guess. But deep down, her remarks unsettled me. Every time she mentioned something oddly specific about my home or my work, it felt like a red flag I couldn't ignore. And then came the knock on my door. That Saturday morning, as I prepared to head to the hardware store, I heard it, a sharp, purposeful knock. When I opened the door, there stood Karen, arms crossed, wearing an expression that could only be described as entitled. "I need a copy of your house keys," she declared, skipping any pleasantries. I blinked, certain I'd misheard her. But no, Karen doubled down, launching into a bizarre explanation about how she wanted to help me with my chores while I focused on my painting. She said it with the confidence of someone offering to water your plants, not someone demanding unrestricted access to your home. I'll admit, I was too stunned to respond at first. My silence must have encouraged her because she added, "I know how busy you get. You'll thank me later." Thank you? I thought. For what? Trespassing? I finally managed to compose myself enough to politely decline. "I appreciate your concern, Karen, but I'm very particular about my space. My supplies can get messy, and I prefer handling it myself." What happened next was nothing short of theatrical. Karen's face flushed a deep crimson, and she began ranting about how I was being unreasonable, ungrateful even. But then, she said something that made my stomach drop. "Besides, I like to admire those paintings of yours. You have them in that little hallway outside the bedroom, right?" My heart skipped a beat. Karen had never set foot in my house. I'd never posted pictures of that hallway, let alone mention it to anyone. So, how did she know? "Wait a second," I said, trying to mask my growing unease. "How do you know about that hallway?" Karen's lips curled into a sly grin. "Oh, I've got a good vantage point from my second floor. Sometimes. I just watch you put them up." She said it like she was commenting on the weather, completely oblivious to how wildly inappropriate and invasive that sounded. At that moment, I didn't know whether to slam the door or confront her. My mind raced with questions. How long had she been watching me? What else had she seen? And most importantly, how could someone be so brazenly intrusive and think it was okay? Karen's confession left me reeling. Who admits to spying on their neighbor with a straight face? And yet, there she was, standing on my porch, acting as if this was normal behavior. My mind raced, but I managed to keep my composure. Karen, I said as calmly as I could, using binoculars to look into someone's home is not okay. That's an invasion of privacy. Her response, a shrug, a literal shrug followed by, "It's not my fault you leave your windows open. Don't you want people to appreciate your art?" I couldn't believe her audacity. There I was, trying to set boundaries, and she had the gall to flip the blame onto me. I firmly told her that I didn't want her watching me or stepping onto my property without an explicit invitation. Then, before she could argue further, I closed the door. I thought that would be the end of it. Surely, she'd realize how inappropriate her behavior was and back off. But Karen wasn't one to take a hint. Later that day, I noticed fresh footprints in the small garden strip alongside my house. I grow herbs there, rosemary, basil, thyme, and the area is fenced off with a low barrier. The footprints were unmistakable, cutting right through the patch. At first, I thought it might have been a stray cat or dog, but the next morning I found more footprints, along with leaves that looked intentionally parted. It was as if someone had pushed them aside to get a better view. My unease grew. That night, I decided to test my instincts. I sat in my darkened living room, lights off, blinds slightly cracked. Every so often, I glanced toward the boundary fence, and there it was, a flicker of movement. My heart raced as I spotted a silhouette, lingering near the edge of my yard. I was terrified. Was Karen spying on me again? What if it wasn't Karen? My mind spiraled with worst-case scenarios. Still, I wasn't ready to involve the police. I needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence. The next day, I confronted her again, this time catching her on her porch as she tended to her flowers. "Karen," I said, trying to remain calm, "I've asked you before. Please stay off my property. Those footprints in my garden, they're yours, aren't they?" She feigned shock, her hand flying to her chest like a soap opera villain caught in the act. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she exclaimed. When I persisted, she waved me off dismissively, smirking as if I were being ridiculous. "If you're so concerned about privacy," she quipped, "maybe you shouldn't leave your windows uncovered." It took everything in me not to lose my temper. Instead, I warned her, "If this continues, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." Her expression shifted instantly. The smirk vanished, replaced by a cold glare. "Go ahead," she snapped. "But don't forget I have friends in the police force." That was clearly a bluff. Karen had never been seen with anyone remotely connected to law enforcement, but the threat still rattled me. After that confrontation, I decided enough was enough. I invested in a set of security cameras, strategically placing them around my property. One at the front walkway, another near the back gate, and a third overlooking the herb garden. To top it off, I installed a motion sensor floodlight on the side yard. The setup cost more than I'd planned to spend, but it brought a sense of relief. At least now I'd have proof if Karen or anyone else tried to invade my space again. And sure enough, the cameras didn't go unused for long. 2 nights later, just as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. Movement detected in the side yard. Heart pounding, I opened the live feed. There, clear as day despite the late hour, was Karen creeping along my fence line. In her hand was what looked like, ironically, a small pair of binoculars. She was peering into my kitchen window. My blood ran cold. This wasn't curiosity. This was stalking. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called the non-emergency police line and reported the trespassing. By the time the officer arrived, Karen had scurried back to her house. But I had video evidence. A crystal-clear clip of her on my property, lingering near my windows in the dead of night. The officer took my statement and suggested I consider filing a restraining order if her actions continued. Part of me wanted to take immediate action, but another part held back, hoping the visit from law enforcement would scare her enough to stop. Spoiler alert, it didn't. If I thought Karen's midnight escapades would end after a visit from the police, I was dead wrong. Instead, her behavior escalated in ways I couldn't have imagined. The very next morning, I woke up to a pounding on my front door. Startled, I rushed to see what was happening. There she was, Karen, her face twisted with anger. She banged so hard on the door it felt like she might break it down. I opened it cautiously, keeping the chain lock in place. Before I could say a word, she started yelling. "You're harassing me with those cameras," she screamed. "You have no right to watch me. You're the problem, not me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here was the same person who'd been prowling around my yard in the middle of the night, now accusing me of harassment for installing cameras on my own property. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so absurd. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible, "those cameras are there to protect me, not to bother you. They're pointed at my property, and I have every right to use them." Her face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Your yard isn't fenced properly," she snapped. "How else am I supposed to take a shortcut?" Shortcut? Through my garden? At midnight? The logic was as nonsensical as her entire argument. I told her firmly that she was trespassing and that I had video proof. If she continued, I'd have no choice but to take legal action. She wasn't having it. "You're stalking me," she declared. "I'll call the police on you." And she did. That same afternoon, I got a call from a local officer. Apparently, Karen had spun some wild tale about how my cameras were pointed directly into her bedroom. The officer arrived at my house to investigate, but it didn't take long to debunk her claims. I showed him the camera angles, all of which were directed at my own property, and even played the footage of Karen creeping around my side yard with binoculars. The officer was understanding and documented everything, but Karen's false accusations left me rattled. She wasn't just being nosy anymore. She was actively trying to turn the tables and paint herself as the victim. Over the next few weeks, Karen's antics became even more unnerving. She started hovering near my property during the day, glaring at my cameras like they were some kind of personal affront. When I left for errands, she'd linger on the sidewalk, watching me pull out of the driveway. And then came the notes. It started with small scraps of paper left on my door. Messages like, "You can't hide forever," and "being neighborly means sharing your space." The audacity of it all was mind-boggling. At first, I tried to ignore them, hoping she'd get bored and move on, but her persistence only fueled my unease. Every time I found a new note, it felt like she was tightening her grip on my peace of mind. Then one night, I noticed something odd. My mailbox flag, the little red lever that indicates outgoing mail, was flipped up. It was strange because I hadn't touched it that day. I brushed it off as a fluke, but the next morning, the flag was up again. And the morning after that, that's when it clicked. Someone was tampering with my mailbox. I adjusted one of my security cameras to cover the mailbox area, and sure enough, the culprit was exactly who I expected. The footage showed Karen strolling past my house late at night, casually flipping the flag up as if it were a game. Why? I had no idea. Was it another intimidation tactic? A way to mess with my head? Whatever her reasoning, it only added to the mounting evidence against her. Around the same time, I noticed something else. My fence gate, which I always latched before bed, was mysteriously unlatched in the mornings. At first, I doubted myself, thinking maybe I'd forgotten. But after the second or third time, I started triple-checking every evening. One night, I caught her on camera again. The footage showed Karen leaning over from her side of the fence, reaching through a gap to unlatch the gate. She didn't walk through it, but the act itself felt deliberate, like another twisted way to assert control over my space. By now, the tension was unbearable. My once quiet home had become a fortress, guarded by cameras and motion lights. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside my window, sent my imagination spiraling. My creativity suffered. Too, whenever I sat down to paint, the fear of Karen lurking outside zapped my focus. It was like she'd invaded not just my property, but my mind. Finally, I confided in a friend, Gavin, who had some experience in law enforcement. Gavin listened patiently as I recounted the whole saga, from the binoculars to the midnight prowling. "You need to document everything," he said. "Every note, every incident, every piece of footage. If you can show a pattern of harassment, you'll have a strong case for legal action." It was the push I needed. That night, I began compiling every shred of evidence I had, timestamps from the cameras, screenshots of Karen's late-night escapades, and even the bizarre notes she'd left on my door. It was time to fight back. With every piece of evidence I gathered, my confidence grew. Karen might have been brazen, but I wasn't going to let her antics intimidate me any longer. I now had video clips of her prowling around my yard, flipping my mailbox flag, and unlatching my fence gate. The notes she left were carefully stored, along with timestamps and detailed descriptions of every incident. But despite the mounting evidence, Karen wasn't slowing down. One night, as I sat in my living room, my motion sensor floodlight flared to life. My phone buzzed with a notification from the camera app. Movement detected in the backyard. I opened the live feed, and there she was again, Karen. This time, she was leaning against the fence, staring directly at one of the cameras. Her expression was chilling, a mix of defiance and amusement, as if daring me to do something about her presence. I decided to confront her the next day. By now, my nerves were frayed, but I knew I had to draw a hard line. "Karen," I said, catching her on her porch as she tended to her plants, "this needs to stop. You're trespassing, leaving notes on my door and messing with my property. I have everything documented, and if this continues, I'll take legal action." Her response was as ridiculous as ever. "I'm just checking to make sure everything's okay," she said with a smirk. "You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" I shot back. "For peeping into my windows at night? For sneaking around my yard with binoculars?" Karen didn't even flinch. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. "If you don't want people looking in, maybe you shouldn't have cameras or floodlights that attract attention." Her twisted logic was infuriating. I told her firmly that if I caught her on my property again, I'd involve the police. But instead of backing down, she upped the ante. The next night, my camera caught her once more, creeping along the fence line. This time, she was carrying what looked like a flashlight. It was as if she was inspecting the perimeter, searching for weak spots in my defenses. I'd had enough. I called Gavin to ask for advice, and he suggested filing for a restraining order immediately. "You've got more than enough evidence," he said. "Don't wait for her to escalate further." But before I could take the next step, Karen made another bold move. It started with a loud knock on my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there, holding what appeared to be a letter. "This is for you," she said smugly, shoving the paper into my hands before walking away. I unfolded it and couldn't believe my eyes. It was a written complaint, addressed to the police, accusing me of harassment. In it, she claimed that my cameras were pointed directly into her bedroom and that I was deliberately shining floodlights into her house to intimidate her. It was the most absurd thing I'd ever read. My cameras were all angled to cover my property, and the floodlights didn't even reach her house. She was grasping at straws, but I knew I couldn't ignore this. I immediately called the local police and explained the situation. When the officer arrived, I showed him the letter and walked him through my setup. He reviewed the camera footage and confirmed that everything was above board. Karen's claims were baseless, but the officer warned me that her actions were escalating and advised me to stay vigilant. It wasn't long before Karen's obsession reached a new level. One night, as I was reviewing footage from the past week, I noticed something strange. My camera had caught her tampering with the latch on my fence again, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had brought a pair of binoculars and what looked like a small notebook. She was scribbling something down, notes, perhaps? A record of my comings and goings? The thought made my skin crawl. What was she planning? At this point, my anxiety was through the roof. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. My once quiet sanctuary had become a place of fear, and I was determined to reclaim it. The next day, I called Gavin and told him I was ready to take legal action. He helped me organize all my evidence: video clips, screenshots, notes, even the absurd complaint Karen had written. We compiled everything into a neatly organized binder, ready to present to the court. But before I could file the paperwork, Karen made one last desperate attempt to rattle me. Karen's next move was so outrageous, it felt like she was practically begging to get caught. It started with my phone buzzing late one night, a notification from my camera app. I opened the feed and froze. Karen was back, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a small garden tool in the other. She was crouched near my herb garden, poking around the soil like she was searching for buried treasure. My heart raced. Was she trying to destroy my plants? Or was she just escalating her bizarre intimidation tactics? Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could while my hands trembled. When the officer arrived, Karen had already retreated to her house. But the footage spoke for itself. The officer reviewed the clip, his expression growing more serious with every second. "You've got enough here to file a restraining order," he said. "I'd recommend doing it sooner rather than later." The next morning, as I prepared to visit the courthouse, Karen struck again. This time, she left a note taped to my door. The message was scrawled in bold, almost frantic handwriting. "You think you can win? You're the one breaking the rules. I'll see you in court." I couldn't believe it. Karen wasn't just crossing boundaries anymore. She was outright challenging me. It was as if she thought she was invincible, immune to consequences. That same day, I officially filed for a restraining order. Gavin accompanied me to the courthouse, his support helping to steady my nerves. We submitted the binder of evidence: video clips of her trespassing, the note she left, and even footage of her spying on me with binoculars. The court date was set, and I felt a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, I was finally taking steps to protect myself. On the other hand, I knew this wasn't going to end without a fight. Karen, of course, wasn't going down quietly. A few days before the hearing, she decided to make yet another police report. This time, she accused me of using my floodlights to deliberately blind her through her bedroom windows. An officer showed up at my door to investigate, but it didn't take long to clear my name. I demonstrated how the floodlights were positioned. They barely reached the edge of my yard, let alone her windows. The officer sighed, clearly frustrated by Karen's antics, and assured me that her complaint would be noted as unfounded. On the day of the hearing, Karen arrived at the courthouse looking surprisingly confident, as if she believed her version of events would sway the judge. She tried to paint herself as a victim, claiming I was an overly paranoid neighbor who was harassing her with cameras and lights. But her story didn't hold up for long. When it was my turn to present my case, I laid out everything: the video footage, the notes, the timestamps. I explained how Karen had been spying on me for months, tampering with my property, and refusing to respect my boundaries. The turning point came when I played the clip of her prowling outside my kitchen window late at night, binoculars in hand. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's expression hardened, and I could see Karen's confidence begin to crack. When she tried to defend her actions, claiming she was just checking on the neighborhood, the judge wasn't buying it. "This is not neighborhood watch behavior," he said firmly. "This is harassment, plain and simple." In the end, the restraining order was granted. Karen was ordered to stay at least 200 feet away from my property and was prohibited from making any direct contact with me. She was also fined for trespassing and made to cover court costs, as well as part of the expenses for my security system. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. The weight of Karen's constant presence had lifted, replaced by the hope that she would finally leave me alone. But even as I walked out of the courthouse, I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let go easily. And sure enough, She had one last trick up her sleeve. Karen's courtroom defeat should have been the end of it, but of course it wasn't. Just a week after the restraining order was issued, she made her final, desperate attempt to undermine me. Late one evening, as I reviewed my security footage, I noticed her standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, glaring directly at one of my cameras. She didn't cross the boundary this time, but her presence felt like a warning, a silent challenge to the legal order. The next day, I heard from the police again. Karen had filed yet another complaint, accusing me of deliberately shining my floodlights into her windows at night. It was absurd, of course. My floodlights were motion-activated and angled well within my property line. Still, I welcomed the officer inside, showing him the setup once more. The officer left, clearly annoyed by Karen's antics, and assured me that her complaint would be dismissed as baseless. But this time, I took things a step further. I forwarded the incident report to the court, reinforcing the pattern of Karen's harassment and her refusal to comply with the restraining order. The court's response was swift. At the follow-up hearing a few weeks later, Karen's behavior was deemed a violation of the restraining order. The judge imposed stricter penalties, expanding the distance she was required to keep from my property and warning her that further complaints or violations would result in criminal charges. That seemed to be the breaking point for Karen. Not long after, I noticed a for sale sign in her yard. Rumors swirled around the neighborhood. Some said she was moving to avoid the mounting legal restrictions. Others claimed she'd grown tired of the scrutiny from my cameras and the community at large. Whatever her reasons, I didn't care. The day her moving truck pulled away was the first time I felt like I could breathe again. With Karen gone, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I reinforced my fence, upgraded my locks, and kept my cameras rolling, but the sense of fear that had gripped me for months began to fade. My creativity returned as well. I poured my emotions into a series of paintings inspired by the ordeal. Pieces that captured the feeling of being watched, the tension of invasion, and the triumph of reclaiming my space. To my surprise, a local gallery expressed interest in showcasing them. The exhibition was a success. Visitors admired the pieces, commenting on the raw emotion and intensity behind them. I didn't share the full story of Karen with the gallery audience, but it felt good to know my art was resonating with people. Meanwhile, my new neighbors were a breath of fresh air. They introduced themselves with homemade cookies and polite questions about the neighborhood, a stark contrast to Karen's intrusive demeanor. We exchanged gardening tips and chatted about local events, building the kind of friendly relationship I had once thought impossible. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized just how important it is to stand up for your boundaries. Karen's bizarre sense of entitlement had pushed me to the brink, but by documenting everything and using the legal system, I was able to reclaim my peace. If there's one silver lining, it's the sense of community that emerged from the chaos. Other neighbors who had their own minor run-ins with Karen came forward, offering support and even upgrading their own home security. Together, we created a safer, more respectful environment for everyone. Karen's house eventually sold, and I haven't seen or heard from her since. Life has moved on, and so have I. My home is once again my sanctuary, a place where I can paint, relax, and enjoy the quiet without fear of intrusion. The experience taught me a valuable lesson. Trust your instincts, set firm boundaries, and never hesitate to fight for your rights. Some people will test those boundaries, but with determination and the right support, you can stand your ground. To those of you listening, let this story serve as a reminder. Your home is your space, and your peace of mind is worth protecting. Thank you for sticking with me through this journey, and until next time, take care and stay safe.